May the angels protect you, trouble neglect you, and heaven accept you when it's time to go home. May you always have plenty, your glass never empty, and know in your belly you're never alone. May your tears come from laughing, you find friends worth having. With every year passing, they mean more than gold. May you win but stay humble, smile more than grumble, and know when you stumble, you're never alone. Never alone, never alone. I'll be in every beat of your heart when you face the unknown. Wherever you fly, this isn't goodbye. My love will follow you, stay with you, baby, you're never alone. Well, I have to be honest, as much as I wanted, I'm not gonna promise the cold winds won't blow. So when hard times have found you and your fears surround you, wrap my love around you, you're never alone. Never alone, never alone. I'll be in every beat of your heart when you face the unknown. Wherever you fly, this isn't goodbye. My love will follow you, stay with you, baby, you're never alone. May the angels protect you, trouble neglect you, and heaven accept you.
Good evening, good evening. Y'all, I could have just stayed with that music. Emily always has the best playlist. So thank you for grounding us in that way, Emily, and good to see everybody. I know we've got a couple of three other folks who may come in and join us. You will see Tim Love Moon right here in the room with us. Hands up, shout him up. That's right, Sean. And I'll tell you more about Tim in a minute or two. We're so delighted. We've been excited to have him for some months, if not over a year now, Tim. Some of us are very familiar with him, and we'll talk a bit about that. I've got a couple of little poems I want to start with to kind of ground us in. One is a poem of friendship by Nikki Giovanni. We are not lovers because of the love we make, but the love we have. We are not friends because of the laughs we spend, but the tears we save. I don't want to be near you for the thoughts we share, but the words we never have to speak. I will never miss you because of what we do, but because of what we are together. And then Mary Oliver has a poem, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's called On Losing a Home, or Losing a House. And the sixth stanza, I guess you call it. I wasn't really good in literature class, but we'll call it that. It says, don't tell us how to love, don't tell us how to grieve, or what to grieve for, or how to lose, or how loss shouldn't sit down like a gray bundle of dust in the deepest pockets of our energy. Don't laugh at our belief that money isn't everything. Don't tell us how to behave in anger, in longing, in loss, in homesickness. Don't tell us, dear friends. I'm always intrigued at why certain words rise up for me in different settings, and those felt like intentional pieces to bring. And I feel like part of the combination of those two is because of the work that we've been doing together these many months, and the insight and the richness that we will receive from Tim tonight And this idea of we know to unearth goodness. That's what we're talking about, right? How do we unearth the goodness around us? And yet sometimes we as individuals, we as congregations can resist, even when we know there's digging to do and there's sorting to happen and there's renunciation to take place. And there can be resistance that comes up. There can be plateauing, which is all right. There can be a need to rest. There can be a rest that um, I think about there's procrastination and then there's contemplation, and they can look very similar, just as excitement and anxiety can feel the same. And so tonight we're going to spend time together talking about that, learning from Tim and the experience he's had for quite some time with a variety of congregations and in his work as a theologian and a sociologist. And so that's why these words popped up, I'm sure. And so take a deep breath with me. Let's just breathe in and hold it for a second and release. And take another deep breath in. How often do we do that during the day? Breathe it in and just hold it. And exhale. And take a second to feel where you're connected to things, whether that's the floor, which is really Mother Earth, whether that's the chair, the shoes on your feet, or your bare feet on a shag rug. Yeah, just ground in together and take a second to look around the room. All of these beautiful faces with ideas and energies and so many things we each bring to the room. We're in this together, and yet we have our individual work to take care of us. So we'll just continue to settle in for a minute. I know that our friend Becky, we want you to have some time for this too. We're just feeling where we're connected to the thing that is us, to the earth, to the carpet, to the chair. We'll see, perhaps you're on your porch. We're here in New Orleans and there's a dark cloud that has gone through uptown that looked really ominous. And as happens, I would bet 62% of the time, it just scooted on through. And so what's around us as we do this work? What's the joy that we had this week? What's the excitement for the summer coming, right? And so we ground in here together. And with that, I will pause because we're going to do our connecting that Emily and Sean are always so beautiful at guiding us through in kind of small groups. So Emily, I'll believe I hand it over to you now. Is that right?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you for that. We are gonna do our shuffle and share. And tonight the question is, what is your favorite day of the week and why? Um, for me, it's Saturday, because I don't have to set my alarm. I love to sleep and I don't have any like set routine that I have to kind of maintain. So Saturday is it for me. So we want y'all to go into groups. I think the group should pop up and just take a couple minutes with each other. Um, just chatting about what what's your favorite day of the week and why? Or if you have more than one, that's also okay. Okay. Do y'all see the groups? Okay, perfect. Okay. We'll give them
Even though I said that storm passed through, I have to look because I can hear thunder. It's like, oh, what's it gonna do? I was kind of hoping for a big, dramatic, safe thunderstorm this afternoon, but it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Maybe next time. We have to have everybody put in the chat what their day was so we can see which wins. Kathy. Give folks a chance to come through. Not yet. Getting there. Definitely getting there. Thank you, and welcome, Kathy. So I was saying we could all put the question for the breakouts, Kathy, was what's your favorite day of the week? I don't know. I think my messages keep going just to Emily, which is hilarious. So mine is Wednesday. Anywho. Welcome everybody. Kathy, we're glad to see you. We've been through the calendar, and now we're gonna settle in. So Tim Love Moon is a person that I imagine having completely different bios for different settings, and so we're going to kind of pull them together, Tim. As a person who has done much study and experience and experiential learning around race and whiteness and theology and congregations. The focus of his study for his doctorate, I'm just going to read the title because it's mind-blowing. Intersections of Ignorance, the complex relationship between white ignorance and Christian ignorance. And it's not to say that we as Christians, we as white people are ignorant. It's to say, where do those pieces percolate? And he's gonna share those components. But he's a person who looks at what's the why of how we get, as I was saying before, how do we get to a certain place and maybe don't get further? Either as an individual or really in the context of congregations, that we have this commitment that we listen to these words, that we hear these messages that are brought forth through Jesus, but also the Old Testament, right? It's all integrated. And we know, and then we don't. Or we resist, or we grumble. And so he's gonna guide us in those components. And he's also a person that has a rich tradition. He's not been in New Orleans for a few years, and yet he comes every Mardi Gras because he's in the 612 steppers. And maybe he'll talk about it. Yeah, Becky knows, right? And so he has a love of life, he has a love of people. And what I see in my experience with you, Tim, is that your commitment to the way that you have studied and bring forth, it's not research, it's a way of living for you. It's a constant exploration internally and externally. And so we're grateful for the opportunity to learn with and from you in the same way that we've been living together. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Tim Love Moon.
Well, thank you for the very kind introduction. I promise not to dance tonight. We'll we'll stick with the academic side tonight. But let me share my screen. Let's see. All right. Can y'all see it? Okay, good. One time I did a whole presentation and then they let me know afterwards that all they could see was my internal screen. I was like, thanks for that. But it's so good to be with y'all. I've been excited and kind of dreaming about this for quite some time. And so I'm very grateful to be in this space and be with you all. Um, Thank you to the St. Charles Center for Faith in Action, Caroline and Emily. Thank you for Shauna and E Pluribus Unum. Um, I've been able to kind of have some of these conversations and hear back as various stages of this dream are coming together. And so I'm so glad to see it fruition and see um, cohort churches that are doing this important work. And thank you to you all. This work is kingdom of God stuff. This is what makes change. And I think this is a particularly important type of work because you're really grounding what you want to do in your own sense of place. And that gives you the context to be able to do the type of work that'll be impactful in your communities and in your context. So um, really grateful for that. So sort of quick, the St. Charles folks don't need a lot of my background because I was a associate pastor there for 5 years while we were in New Orleans. And so they all know me, and it's so good to see all of your faces. But that's so I have this part of me that is they went to seminary and was a minister for many years, but also started to ask other questions that were both related to the church, but I felt like I needed a lens outside of that. And so that brought me into sociology, where I really focus on um, the way congregations, religious organizations engage with issues of race and gender and sexuality. Um, but I think for tonight, I'm going to primarily come from a sociological lens. Um, and I think it's really helpful because it helps us see things as they actually are. So we're looking at patterns and what's occurring. It also gives us the ability to see kind of taken for granted hidden barriers that exist, so that we can really know what we're dealing with, and we can imagine how things can change, right? And so I think um, that can be part of that um, gift of moving to like, what is good news and what can good news look like in our context? And so I think sociology is a helpful lens in that way. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So let's jump in, right? So we're going to be talking about the power of non-knowing, and I'll explain better what that is here in a few minutes. But anytime I share with people, my students, settings like this, I like to start with this quote, right? Because I'm a critical scholar. And so anytime we talk about these things, we're talking about heavy things. But I appreciate this quote from Paulo Freire, um, Brazilian thinker, wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But he says it's imperative that we maintain hope even when the harshness of reality may suggest the opposite. Because anytime we look at things sociologically, there's some heaviness to it. Looking at the data, looking at some of these trends, they can feel as if maybe that we can't change them, or upend them, or make any meaningful change. But I don't think that's true, and I think that I come at looking at these things from a critical lens because I do think that change can happen and needs to happen. So I like to kind of center those conversations there. So today, some of what we're going to be talking about, when Caroline and I spoke long, long ago, um, we kind of talked about what I did and what I was researching, and she was like, can we talk about what are barriers that well-meaning congregations and congregants face, right, when they're pursuing racial justice and doing any of that kind of work. So we could talk about a lot of different barriers. We're going to focus on a few key ones, some based in my research and around those areas. But yeah, that's going to be kind of our guiding question, is what are those barriers? And particularly amongst well-meaning congregations, right? So when we're wanting to get it right, what still gets in the way, right? So we'll kind of go through some of those pattern barriers that I found in my research. Then we're going to look at non-knowing as a resource, but also a mechanism for oppression. Then we're going to kind of talk about individual level non-knowing and have a discussion. And then we're going to talk about structural non-knowing and its connection to our history telling. And then we'll do a breakout discussion in your congregational groups. And then we're going to kind of look at Jesus's response to non-knowing to kind of ground our thoughts and ideas on this. Before we get started, though, I'd like to be definitional. And so I know as y'all, I got to look through some of the conversations that y'all been having, and I know that you'll probably have some different definitions of racism. So I just want to provide one so we have common ground as we talk today. This is from David Wellman. He says it's a system of advantage, and I add, and disadvantage based on race, right? So we know that race is socially constructed, right? It's based on skin color and physical differences, but all the meaning attached to it is socially constructed, right? We've created that as human beings and as societies. So when we talk about racism, we're talking about that system, right? So this can express itself individually through implicit bias as well as explicit racism. But one of the things that sociology is particularly good at noting is those structural things, right? So we also know that race matters in terms of our institutions and organizations and things like that. And if our outcomes or access to things continue to differ based on these socially created categories, we would define that as racism, right? That's some sort of structural racism where we continue to produce these unequal outcomes again and again, right? And so with that being said, that like this can occur with or without the intent of individuals, right? One of the most well-known sociologists in terms of race, his name's Eduardo Bonilla Silva, and he wrote a book, Racism Without Racists, and he says racism doesn't need racists, right? Because those structures can keep moving, even if there's no ill intent, right? Because those have been kind of structured into the way we do life. Okay, so now that we have that kind of common definition, I want to talk a little bit about the state of the white church in the United States, and get a little bit, we could go in more depth, but for the sake of time, I won't. But if you have any questions about this, I'm happy to answer them after. But I did some research for my dissertation. It's now on a journal article. So looking at a nationally representative sample of congregations across the United States from 2019. I want to kind of give you all some context, and I focus particularly on historically white denominations in their congregations. So we see that 74% of historically white denominations have made some sort of statement, right? Some sort of public facing statement denouncing racism and calling for some sort of congregational action. So on the face of it, that seems really positive, right? That 3/4 of congregations in these historically white denominations are making these statements, right? But I think you know probably what's about to come. When we looked into like action and what these congregations are doing, we see a different story, right? So 21.2% of congregations in these historically white denominations engage in a high level of action to address racial injustice. This is as of 2019, right? So that's a big disparity, right? So the things that at least at the denominational level they're saying are important, and what's actually happening at the congregational level are disconnected. And so as you'll note, this is the data I had. This is from 2019, obviously with the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. I would suspect that there is an increase in those statements, and maybe an increase in congregational activity, although that'll be something that we'll want to see once data is available on that. But right, so 21.2% of those congregations are kind of high activity, or higher activity. So that's a good thing in one way, right? That we see 1/5 of those congregations kind of doing some of this work. But then it can be disheartening as well, because that means a lot of congregations are not doing much of anything or very little. And so the way I measured the actions that they were doing, based on the data I had, was if congregations are doing joint worship services at least once a week. Once a year, sorry. So joint worship services with a congregation of a different race or ethnicity. If they had any sort of discussion groups around racial relations, race and policing, or if they had any sort of committee that was focused on diversity initiatives, and then if they did any sort of social activism out in the community. And so while those aren't an exhaustive list of measures, those should give us a pretty good idea if congregations are active or not. And so we saw that on the whole, they tend to not be. And so we see this huge dissonance between what congregations say and what they actually do. And so the big question kind of becomes why? Why is there this disconnect between word and deed? So if we look at kind of sociological research and theory on organizational practices, we see a couple of things happening, right? We see that all organizations are dealing with a couple of different pulls towards towards their activity, right? Externally, they are constantly trying to signal legitimacy with their outside environment, right? And those greater cultural values. Because organizations want to continue to exist, they want to continue to thrive. And so when there's pressure from the outside to look or be a certain way, they have to adhere to that. And so if we think about this in terms of racial justice, almost nobody today wants to appear as racist, right? There are very few groups, organizations, or people who adhere to that. So they're going to try to seem non-racist or anti-racist, right? And so we see examples of this in 2020. We see organizations coming out of the woodwork to say have some sort of statement about racial justice or things like that, right? We see businesses like Bath and Body Works who make smell good candles and smell good lotions and soaps, and all of a sudden they have an anti-racism statement, right? That is because of that external pressure. But we also know that organizations are concerned about internal pressures as well. They want to maintain the good faith of their members, right? And so for congregations, we are volunteer organizations. And so if people don't like what we're doing, they can leave, right? And so that's a real pressure. And so organizations are constantly balancing between those two competing pressures. And so what we see kind of develop out of that are two primary barriers, right? We see that one, there's what we call loose coupling or that disconnect, right? We see the disconnect between what organizations say and what they actually do. So when I did my research, I kind of let the data divide itself based on patterns into classes or clusters. And so what we saw is the vast majority fell into that loosely coupled cluster where they do very little action. And if they do sometimes do like one action, but they're not high activity, and that 21% is the high activity. And then another thing I identified is what I call symbolic allyship. And this is that those organizations gravitate towards more highly symbolic actions with lower requirements for any sort of change within the organization, right? So when I say symbolic, I don't mean performative. I don't mean it doesn't mean anything, but I just mean they're trying to mark with the external environment that something important, that they're doing something important, right? So I'm not critiquing their intent behind that. However, what we do see because of these external and internal pressures, we do see that when organizations act, they tend to act in the ways that are going to be the least impactful and the least require the least cost in terms of change. So we do see those things both amongst the loosely coupled and the more tightly coupled, that organizations are just going to lean towards those lower intensity, lower cost kind of activities, right? However, what we know is that can have some impacts, right? Because if we see that like 74% of organizations, or it may be higher today, have made some sort of statement speaking out against racial injustice, calling for racial justice and organizational activity. If they're saying those things, it would make it seem like to the larger culture that the church is engaged and is working towards this. But if they're actually not doing much, that kind of hides or masks the fact that there's actually pretty low congregational activity, right? So that creates this non-knowing where we as a society don't actually know how much work's being done and what kind of work's being done and what it looks like. So because of that, I want to kind of focus on non-knowing because I think that is a key mechanism and a key process that can disrupt especially well-intentioned organizations. So we often, when we think about knowledge, we think about that as a cultural resource or a tool, but we don't often think about non-knowing as a resource, right? So I'll give a couple of examples of things that we may all do because we all use not knowing to navigate the social world, right? So, I mean, probably many of you have pretended you haven't heard a story that a friend or family member tells for the 1 millionth time because you want that person to save face, right? You want them to not feel silly or out of place or anything like that. So you'll not know that they've told you that story before, right? Also, one that's really important for me, I'm looking on social media and I see the opportunity to adopt a really cute furry friend, right? And I may pretend that I don't already have a lot of furry animals at home, so so that I may end up adopting that one, right? And so I can not know about that, and that can be a way to navigate the world, right? So we can think of a lot of different ways that actually not knowing things can be a resource, right? We also know that not knowing is a clunky thing to say, and we actually have a different word that we typically use for it, right? And that word is ignorance. Um, and so in sociology, we actually we have a whole field that talks about ignorance, right? And rather than looking at it as a point of weakness or a lack of intelligence or anything like that, we look at it as a cultural tool, right? And what we tend to, and before I got into this literature, I thought of ignorance as being the opposite of knowledge. It's actually a twin or a connected to knowledge, right? And so it's something that people can use, be very rational in choosing to use it. They can be very strategic in using it. Um, and so I think one thing to acknowledge is if knowledge is power, then so is ignorance, right? And so if you look at this photo on the left side of this slide, you see this is from a protest in Australia, and you see protesters putting their head in the sand, right? And so what they're doing is calling out harmful climate policies by the government. And so sort of simultaneously, um, they're calling out that the government is being ignorant or not knowing about impacts of climate change, but they're also using it as a form of resistance, right? So um, as the protester. So we have this balance between ignorance or not knowing can be used both as a form of oppression and a form of resistance. Um, Today, based on the nature of what we're talking about, we're going to look at it as a form of oppression and how it operates in that way. And so ignorance is something that has been recognized for quite some time. This is a quote from James Baldwin, but it's also been noted by race scholars as well as feminist scholars. But ignorance allied with power for James Baldwin is the most ferocious enemy justice can have, right? And so all the things that Baldwin could have said, ignorance was the one, right? So he was saying, he's specifically talking in this quote about both racial and sort of class-based ignorance. But he says that that disrupts our ability to seek justice, right? And as I was kind of thinking through the lineage of this, I think that we can also see some evidence of this through kind of a critical reading of the Bible, right? So um, I do want to acknowledge how ignorance has a much older history, at least back to biblical times. But right, this is a thing that humans have used for a very long time. So if we look in Matthew 21, we're going to kind of look at Matthew 21 through 23 today. But if we look at those chapters, kind of setting the stage, right? So you have Jesus coming into Jerusalem on the donkey. He's the triumphal entry, right? And then he comes in and really there are all these elements to which the way he enters Jerusalem that is kind of a nod and kind of upending ideas about the power of empire, right? And he's sort of doing all these symbolic things that point to the Roman Empire, right? And then he comes in and he goes into the temple and flips over the tables and he starts healing people, right? So he's kind of pushing back against religious power. And so in those chapters 21 through 23, he's sort of moving back and forth between Jesus and the religious powers of the day, right? So the priests, elders, the Pharisees, Sadducees, all those, he's kind of pushing back and having a back and forth dialogue with all of them. And so let me read this passage for us and kind of note where we see some power dynamics and some ignorance at play, right? So Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him. "By what authority are you doing these things?" they asked. "And who gave you this authority?" Jesus replied, "I will also ask you one question. If you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or of human origin?" They discussed it among themselves and said, "If we say from heaven, he will ask, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say of human origin, we are afraid of the people, for they all hold that John was a prophet." So they answered Jesus, "We don't know." Right? Um, so I think this is important to recognize because Jesus, this whole conversation is about religious powers and authority, right? So that is centered in what they're talking about here. And they're sort of being strategic in the way they answer Jesus because they know that he has healed, they know that he has power, but they also are being strategic and they know that depending on how they answer, those answers are going to have impacts, right? So if they sort of acknowledge that the power came from heaven, then they're acknowledging the power of John and in turn the power of Jesus, right? That it comes from God. In which case they'd be kind of acknowledging that they're giving up some of their own power. But if they refuse to say and they go to say that it was human, this sort of gives power to the people, right? Because they know that the people see John as a prophet and having power from God. And so they don't want to disrupt that. So they're sort of stuck between these two ways. And so to protect power, they insert ignorance, right? Even though they have many opinions on what's going on, they say they don't know. So this is a pretty interesting thing because one of the big themes of Matthew is be not afraid, right? Do not be afraid. But they're kind of showing that their fear and their concern about losing power is guiding the way they're acting, right? And so in this case, this seems to be sort of a form of strategic or willful ignorance. But certainly, and we'll see in a minute, ignorance doesn't always have to be intentional, right? It can be unintentional. So with that, let's shift and kind of talk about ignorance in our modern context, and let's focus in a way, rather than this would be religious ignorance, let's focus on race-based ignorance. So if we look at white ignorance, right, as a concept and an idea, again, this is not a form of weakness or not intelligence, but it's a form of power, and it's one that can be used by the powerful. So when we define white ignorance, we just say it's any sort of non-knowing where white racism or the protection of white domination plays a causal role, right? And so this differentiates it between anytime white folks use non-knowing, that if it's not connected to race, then that would be a different type of ignorance, right? So this is just when it's connected to race and protecting the racial hierarchy as it is. One thing that's important to note, and scholars have noted, is that ignorance is actually a key mechanism that upholds every racial project, right? Every form of racism as it's evolved over time and changed over time. Ignorance has been a key part of that, right? In Manifest Destiny, in enslavement, Jim Crow, various iterations of anti-immigration sentiment and legal things connected to that, as well as our colorblind era, right? So today we kind of say we no longer see race or race no longer matters, but we know that it does, right? So to use logics like minimizing racism and say it's not as big a deal today, that is built in ignorance. To say that, to kind of ignore the history of our country and say that unequal outcomes are based on individual effort and differences in individual effort, right? That's ignorant or ignores those historical realities, right? So it's sort of ahistorical logic. So white ignorance is really important in upholding racism. A couple other things to note is ignorance is about both absence and presence. So when we talk about ignorance, typically we're talking about the absence, right? The absence of knowledge. But what we know today is we have lots of information at our fingertips. And so the absence of knowledge, this is absence of knowledge that is actually readily available, right? But ignorance is also presence, right? It's presence of the false beliefs, ideologies that sort of mystify the reality of racial inequality, right? So one example would be like discovery narratives, right? So as we learned, many of us probably in school, that like Christopher Columbus and others discovered the New World. But we know, right, from even from historical narratives that they didn't discover anything. Millions of people already lived there, right? And so that's absence of knowledge that's readily available and sort of a reframing of what occurred. But that also requires the presence of false beliefs, right? It requires the presence of stereotypes about indigenous people and their full humanity, things like that, right? So you see um, the use of absence and presence in engaging in ignorance. And then I want to kind of touch on one last aspect of white ignorance is that it can be both individual and structural, right? So it can be expressed in individuals in the way that they navigate the social world, right? They can pretend to not know things or strategically not gather pieces of information to protect their non-knowing, right? But it can also be structured into the way we live, and that can also impact the way people have access to knowledge, right? So one example would be a study that was done by Nelson, where they looked at the knowledge that white and black people had about the history of racism, right? And so they saw that white people had much lower knowledge of that history. And that was directly correlated to their reduced perceptions that systemic racism still existed, right? So you can think of that in a couple different ways, right? The one would be that they are individually deciding to navigate that way. So that's a little bit more intentional. But the other would be that it's structural, right? That the way that they were educated, the things they were taught, the things that they had access to, the way that they were taught in their education system, if they're structurally disconnected from that knowledge, right, then that could also explain why maybe they have these perception gaps, right? So it can be more individual level and be expressed more willfully, or it can be kind of unintentional based on the way our society is structured, right? And so one thing I think that is important is to focus less on intent and whether someone intended or did not intend to do those things. And it's more instructive the impact that that has, right? Because when people don't know things, it can impact their views, it can impact their perceptions of problems as well as the solutions, right? So I want to talk for a second about how prevalent white ignorance is, right, within individuals. And so in some research I did for my dissertation, it's actually quite prevalent, right? So I looked at 3 different measures of what I call white ignorance. And so when asked questions about disparities between Black and white individuals in terms of wealth, in terms of outcomes in the criminal justice system, and in terms of healthcare access, this is amongst white Christians. They were asked if they thought these things were a major problem, minor problem, or not a problem, right? And so all these things are supported by evidence, right? There is accessible data out there that shows that there are big disparities. So anytime someone says it's not a problem or a minor problem, that would be identified as some form of ignorance, right? Of being disconnected from reality and what's actually occurring, which harms folks, right? And so we see that a significant portion. So if you look at each of these measures, almost 75% of people don't in this sample don't think that wealth disparities are a big problem. criminal justice, almost 58%, and in health disparities, 60% don't see this as a major problem, right? So again, when we have this kind of perception gap and disconnect and this ignorance expressing itself, this disconnects them from racial inequality, but it also impacts whether they see this as a problem and if they think solutions are necessary, right? So this is kind of our ignorance lens that I think is a helpful one to understand. And so I want to here in a second shift into a breakout discussion. Um, and so I want each group to recall an example where you or someone you know displayed a non-knowing, either through the absence of knowledge that was available or the presence of beliefs that obscured the realities of racial injustice. And I only think it's fair if I'm going to ask y'all to be vulnerable that I do the same. And so I'll give an example to kind of give some context. Um, so for myself, uh, I think back to my experience as a history major in college. So I went to Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, and I studied history, right? And so Birmingham was a center for the civil rights movement. And so a lot of what I studied and a lot of the research I did was on the civil rights movement. I remember spending hours in the Birmingham Public Library looking over documents about how Bull Connor closed recreational sites such as pools, and he even cemented in golf holes so that they could not be integrated, right? It was kind of a, if we can't keep it segregated, then nobody gets to use it mentality. So I remember studying all this, being well versed in kind of what had happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But then I also remember going to a chapel where a Black businessman spoke. It was kind of to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the civil rights movement. And he was speaking about some of his experiences in the business world. And he was mentioning some microaggressions that he was experiencing. Um, and I remember still being disconnected on making that connection, right? I remember being very clear that there were some major issues and problems in the 1960s in Birmingham, but I wasn't sure how his experience of this microaggression was still sort of a problem. And I think I knew that there was something wrong in my perception there because I remember that so clearly, but I didn't know what it was. Um, and so looking back on it from today, I can see how those microaggressions were kind of reasserting problematic stereotypes, and it was still kind of reinforcing hierarchies in the workplace and that certain people had more access to upper mobility and people of color did not. And so I can see why it's problematic, but at the time I couldn't, even though I studied that history. Um, and so I recognize that as white ignorance, right? It was upholding my understanding of the situation and thus my perspective on the problem and potential solutions. Um, right. And so I, as a well-meaning person, was still having those gaps, even though I was very educated and had lots of access to information, right? So I want us for each of you to think about a situation for yourself or someone you know, and then I want you to also consider these two secondary questions. And this is really what I want you to focus on, is what individual and or structural factors helped uphold this ignorance for you, right? So what kind of helped maintain that? What were those structural individual factors? And then what were the structural individual factors that helped dismantle this ignorance? What helped you overcome that veil over your eyes? So let's take the next few minutes in our breakout groups, and then we'll come back together and share. Welcome back, everyone.
I feel bad that three of us got to talk and one of them, Pamela, didn't get to finish her story. I hope we can hear that later, Pamela.
Certainly, I want to make sure y'all get, make sure that y'all get to share that. Did anything kind of come up, or did y'all see some similarities in your stories, or? In particular, what were some of the things that helped kind of dismantle that ignorance or disrupt that for you all?
Well, one similarity that I observed, it seemed to me that in a lot of cases, what prompted the ignorance was white privilege. You know, when you're immersed in white privilege,
Mm-hmm.
you have the privilege of not having to see things any other way. And in a lot of cases, from our examples, what helped educate our ignorance was being confronted by a person of color who, in a sense, confronted us with their reality and confronting us with the white privilege, and it kind of rips off your blinders.
Thank you, Chris.
I'm not hearing anything.
For the folks in our group, it was really personal interactions that taught us about our ignorance, particularly personal interactions with people of color, people of difference. But generally, it was somebody else who brought it to our attention directly or indirectly.
Yeah, for me, it was sort of this slow exposure. And so I learned all this history that kind of lay dormant for a while. But then kind of in my time in seminary, I started to learn some theology around social justice, plus kind of when my spouse was in her PhD program in sociology, I was kind of gleaning some of her information uh, and kind of starting to see a little bit more about the connection between then and now. And quite frankly, my time at St. Charles was also really formative. I remember we um, did some book clubs. I think I heard you mention this, Becky. We read The New Jim Crow. That was very formative for me to have kind of some data and a story told so clearly that that made it so obvious to me that I was missing a significant part of the experience that some folks face when engaging the criminal justice system. So, yeah. Well, I know we can't stay together forever, right? We have limited time together um, tonight, and so just because we can't finish this conversation doesn't mean I more than welcome you to continue thinking through this and thinking through the way that these things have impacted you, whether in the way you viewed the world or the way you experienced the world, because these are important things to recognize and to start to see in the world around us. But let's kind of pivot and kind of move into a little bit more of a focus on structural white ignorance. And that's where we're going to kind of take class next. Class. This isn't class. This is our time together. I'm so used to teaching college students. But as we think about structural white ignorance in the way white churches tell their history, which kind of starts to directly get onto some of what you are doing with IDAT, right? Is trying to tell that history in your own unique context. And so I want to draw on W.E.B. Du Bois, the sort of the father of American sociology, sort of, I think, the GOAT, the greatest of all time of sociologists, who was way ahead of his time in speaking into a lot of the ways we think about race today. But when he says, when he's talking about the white church, large picture, general white church, he notes that the ways that Christian denominations, despite their theological and social differences, have been collectively marked by their encounter with white supremacy in ways that have produced overarching similarities, right? So some of what he's recognizing is that even though there may be these theological and social differences, when you get down to it, the white church still is impacted by white supremacy and by racism, right? And so this is important to know. This is, like I was talking about my research earlier, this is why we see being low activity in terms of addressing racial justice or racial reconciliation is normative in the white church, right? And while there may be these great differences between denominations, and certainly more like kind of justice-oriented progressive denominations are going to have higher levels of activity overall, still it's not across the board and it's not overwhelming. So we see some similarity in outcomes across the white church. And so I want to kind of think through and talk specifically as we talk about history, kind of what Du Bois sees as some of these similarities in the telling of history. Right. So some of the key harms he sees in terms of the white church's telling of history is revisionism, right? And I kind of break this down in two ways as we think about telling our stories. The first is when a story is told and it erases the white church erases its role in maintaining racial inequality, right? So this is a form of absence. And so this can happen in a couple of different ways, either through active or passive oppression. Right. So, I mean, it could be that the white church was actively oppressing racial minorities or was culpable in that. And it could be passive, right? It could be that it was just silence or not weighing in on things at all, or just being part of the larger culture that was racist, right? That is still, when those stories aren't told, that's kind of erasing that role, right? And that can be hard work. That can be a hard story to tell, certainly, but that is part of that disrupting those narratives of ignorance, right? Second is sort of these overly triumphant narratives that take credit for social progress, right? So it's sort of this rethinking after the fact of how our congregation was always supportive of this, right? And that there was never a time when they weren't. So taking credit when there's no credit due, or when there is some role in that to maybe overinflate it. Right. And so that can also be an issue because that sort of remembers what occurred and sort of creates some collective amnesia about what's at stake and what's happening. And so these forms of revisionism can be very harmful. And I think you'll know that, which is why you're doing this important work. But it does have impact on us, right? And then the final thing that I want to highlight is that disconnect between then and now, right? Kind of as I was telling my story about going to Sanford, I consistently had this disconnect between then and now. And during the breakout time, I was talking with Emily, and I was realizing that this had just has occurred to me that I may be being the professor now that I wanted, right? Where I explicitly make those connections between our history and today, right? I take time to explicitly talk about redlining and how it impacts our cities today, right? Because I didn't get that. My professors made those connections, but they left them implicit, right? They taught me about racial history, but they never explicitly connected it to today. And so that is another thing about you all's work that I think is so important, is that you're making those connections between your church at a period in time and how that connects to today. So I want to use an example to kind of access this and kind of engage Du Bois' lens on ignorance. So I chose First Baptist Church of Birmingham, Alabama, because their history is pretty well documented, right? So we sort of know some things that were occurring during this period. So I will read this for you all in case the type is small. And then, but what I want you to be thinking about is what is missing here, right? What are they missing in their history as we look through it? So I want to read through this, and then I want us to kind of process through what they're missing, right? Okay, so this is a cut from their history page on their website, right? So I just went there and I cut out this section that I think will be evident why it's important. Right, so when Dr. Hobbs resigned because of ill health, Dr. John Slaughter was called as pastor. At the time, the church faced some financial difficulties because of the Depression, but this didn't stop their dedication to missions. In the 1940s, when the nation had healed from the Depression, First Baptist began to prosper both in membership and finances. And on May 23rd, 1946, the church was debt-free. In the 1980s, when AmSouth Bank approached the church to buy downtown property, the decision was made to relocate. Dr. Andrew Tampling led the church in its move to the present location on Lakeshore Drive in the Homewood area. The church was able to buy land where the present home of Stanford University had previously been located. Okay, so based on what we just talked about with Du Bois, what's missing here?
What happened in the church between 1952 and 1980? Why did they choose to move to the Lakeshore Drive? Why did they choose to leave downtown? Sounds like there was what I think we now call gentrification, and was maybe then called urban renewal, was beginning to happen. I'm not sure, but anyway.
It was called white flight. I recognize this story because it happened all over the South.
Mm-hmm.
I saw evidence of that repeatedly in Houston. And I actually got caught in a situation where the white church was moving out. The black church, Union Baptist Association, had worked out a kind of a peaceful arrangement to transfer title. And they asked me if I wanted to come do a story about a transfer that was occurring in North Houston. And I got there and had representatives of the white congregation on one side, representatives of the black congregation on the other side. And in the middle was the desk to sign the deed to transfer the church from a white church to a black church. And I wouldn't say innocently, but I, like a good newspaper reporter said, why didn't y'all just integrate? I don't understand. Why are we going through all of this? And a woman from the black congregation said, because they didn't want us. And the white pastor said, you didn't want to come have anything to do with us. And I mean, it turned almost into a brawl, but it so perfectly epitomized. And I think that's what Kathy was seeing in this transition, is what I'm seeing here. There was too much like that going on, too much.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of history there. We know a lot of what happened. I remember one of the first things I thought was odd when I moved to Birmingham and went to Stanford was that the First Baptist Church of Birmingham was in Homewood, right? It wasn't even in Birmingham. Um, yeah, and so I think we see some absence there. We also there's a church Baptist Church of the Covenant that actually split with First Baptist over integration, right? And so that's when those churches parted ways. And so to not acknowledge any of that, or to not even try to talk about how that's connected between then and now, right? Um, is a major absence, right? And creates that disconnect. Becky.
Well, there were also major things happening in Birmingham all around them. And
Yes.
I don't see any of that here. Now, maybe you just picked out two disparate times and not stuff in between, but I find that church histories often are very internally focused and don't take into consideration what's going on in the broader world and how or if they are responding in any way. I mean, we like to talk about giving to missions, which this does back in the, 20s to 50s. But there's not a whole lot of description of what does that mean? And is that connected to justice, or is that connected to, throwing a few coins at the poor people as a additional
Mhm.
way, as Freire would say, to actually reinforce and support the continuation of the oppression, which is a hard thing for people to hear, but it's also something that we can easily do well-meaningly and not realize that we're doing it. Sorry for that tangent.
Mm-mm. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that they mentioned the Depression, but then all of a sudden they get ahistorical real quickly, right? Um, so
Well, and they also act in this history as if when the nation had healed from the Depression in the 40s, not everybody was healed from the Depression in the 40s. Not every white person was healed from the Depression in the 40s,
mhm.
much less BIPOC folks. And so there's a lot left out here.
There's also a world war going on in the early 40s.
Their minister at the time was also one of the people that MLK was writing to in the letter to Birmingham jail. There's all kinds of stuff, right? And I think we could talk about that, right? And it's not that this is an exceptional case; it's that it's a pretty normal one. Is what we're looking at here. So I want to get kind of internal and introspective and start to think about this in y'all's own context with your with the folks in your own congregational cohort. So I want us to pivot and spend some time in our breakouts engaging with kind of a critical ignorance lens to understand our own congregational history. And I know this is the work y'all been doing, but hopefully with this lens, it helps kind of clarify some of the ways you're thinking about it. So I want you to do it told as is on your website, right? So I looked at all your websites. I know that you may have deeper history somewhere, but I just want what's public facing, what's everybody see if they come look at you, right? So I want you to recognize what remains not known regarding the history of race and racism or racial justice in your congregation. And does the current history fall into any of these pitfalls that we've kind of mentioned when we talked about Du Bois? Right. So do you see any examples of erasure, absence, overly triumphant kind of narratives, disconnects between then and now? So I want you to kind of to go to your own things, and you can click on these links, or I think Emily can post the links in the chat. And I want y'all to take some time looking at that and kind of processing through that based on the research and the work that y'all have done so far.
I think we're all back. Can't tell.
Is Tim back? Where's Tim?
Can y'all see me?
We can see you and hear you.
Oh, good. I can't see y'all. Can everybody see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. It's weird. It says I'm a participant of one, so I was getting really
Yes.
sad. Unfortunately, I can't see you all, so I don't want to mess anything up though. So
We can see your screen too.
okay, good. Um, well, I hope that y'all's conversations were fruitful. I know that they were certainly not complete, but I hope this lens kind of adds a layer as you continue this work and think through this. Because I really think that this type of work is impactful. And I popped in on a couple on all the groups, but I noticed in one of the groups, you were talking about how churches don't do this type of stuff and don't address sort of the negative aspects of history. But I think that's important, right? Because that is part of our history, and that's part of what it means to be human and what it means to um, be a collective, right? In a society or a congregation or whatever it is. And so um, figuring out how to acknowledge that in an honest way, but also in a hopeful way is some of the work that you are doing. I also think that this particular project is kind of telling your history and then trying to connect it to the now, and thinking about how that can spur into context specific action is hugely important, right? So I hope to hear great things from this as y'all continue to do this work. This is an area I've been interested in. I've started thinking about doing research on kind of content analysis on how congregations talk about or in many cases don't talk about any of these parts of their history, because that's relevant. Also, as I kind of looked through all your statements and in your histories, I also looked at to St. Paul's in Richmond and saw some of the stuff they did. And if y'all haven't looked at theirs yet, I do think there's some really good ways of talking about some of their the tougher parts of their history, and how their history has been moved in positive ways and negative ways, and has kind of ebbed and flowed in some of those instances. So I think that's as you look at exemplars, that's a good one. So I kind of want to wrap up with just bringing it back to kind of where we ended up with kind of Jesus and the biblical narrative and how he addresses religious ignorance, right? So if we kind of fast forward to Matthew 23, Jesus kind of expresses his woes to the Pharisees, the scribes, to basically all the religious leaders, right? Because they're kind of using ignorance and non-knowledge to kind of maintain and protect power. And so a couple of things that are noted in chapter 23, I think are really relevant to what's going on and some of the things we talked about, right? So you see in verse 3, he kind of is critical of them saying things but not doing them, right? So that's kind of that idea of loose coupling the disconnect between what we say and what we do. He notes their love of honor and kind of power. Um, he notes that they're sort of gatekeepers for the kingdom of heaven, right? As Jesus has sort of been highlighting, that when we look at the gates, they're open a lot wider than most people expect. And so he's kind of trying to invite everybody in to this way of life, right? and so he's trying to expand who gets in, right? And so he's letting them know that. He uses a couple of metaphors to describe them. He uses the cup metaphor. You wash the cup on the outside, but the inside's disgusting kind of logic. Or you whitewash your tombs, but on the inside it's yucky and gross, and there's dead things, and right. And so he's kind of saying, looking good on the outside, but you need to be aware of internally as well, right? And again, this gets to that kind of loose coupling idea that we have to put a critical lens on when we do front-facing positive things, make statements and claims, that those also need to be connected to kind of what we do and how we live. And then at the end of these kind of woes, he's always kind of calling them in, right? He never cuts ties with them. He's kind of inviting them, and it says, as a hen gathering her chicks under her wing, right? It is kind of that last metaphor for who Jesus is. And so as we think about this work and we think about sort of our exemplar for doing it, I think some of the things to note about Jesus, and maybe some things we can take from his from what he's done, and kind of how he handled um, acknowledging and speaking truth to ignorance, right? Is speaking truth to power, um, problematizing that disconnect between words and deeds through kind of staying aware. Um, Also being confrontational, which is, I know, can be very scary, but while also trying to call everybody in, right? Not cutting people off, but trying to find ways to bring them in. And then finally, by stirring our imagination for what's possible, because I think that is a key part of what the way of Christ teaches us to do. So that is all I have for you all. I'm really grateful for your time, and from all I learned from y'all. And so I want to turn it back over to y'all.
Thank you so much, Tim. Wow. Much food for thought, much thought for nourishment. Tremendously appreciative for all of that. And the materials and the information will be up on the Mighty Networks coming forward. And yeah, and you have Tim's email and each other as well. So thank you so much. There's a poem by Anise Nin. And then came the day when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk to bloom. I share that poem along with my announcement that this is my last week at the St. Charles Center for Faith and Action. It has been a remarkable almost 4 years as the inaugural executive director to watch so many of the programs grow, but the Indeed and Truth in particular, because so much of what you all are doing, so much of what this has been offering, is what the St. Charles Center for Faith and Action is about. It's been a real honor to be in the role with the center. I've loved getting to know all of you. I put in the chat my next iteration. I have for some years been doing workshops and trainings for mostly public defenders, my people in other ways, and social justice workers on how do we take care of ourselves in the work. And in the past bit of time, I felt the real calling that I'm meant to do that fully. And so I will serve as a wellness and resilience coach and organizational consultant. So not just how are we doing it individually, but how are organizations taking care of their people as they go into this world to serve justice, to bring love, to walk humbly. And so just wanted to take a minute to say thank you to you all. Thank you to the team here, Shauna and Emily. It's been beautiful and wonderful, and thank y'all so much. And with that, I will turn it over to Shauna.
So are you not going to be back for any of the other sessions?
No, I won't. There's a chance that I will be here for the summit, but you're in capable hands. And there's the board and the staff have been working to identify the next executive director. And so the people that they're looking at are remarkable and bring a variety of skill sets. So they will step in as they're meant to take this seat that I'm in. So peace and love to you all.
Thank you, Caroline, for your work with us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And good luck to you.
Thank you. And I will travel the country. So if you've got an organization that is looking for guidance on how to take care of their people, give me a call. I'll take care of them.
And we'll make sure to share that out to everyone. And thank you from us too. It's just been really amazing to be able to do this particular project with you as well. It was something that both of our organizations thought about for a long time and wanted to do. And really, if it weren't for the center, it would not be happening. EPU is a happy partner, proud partner, but it is not our project. And I know that I wouldn't be sitting here if it weren't for the work of the center. And so thank you, Caroline, for that, and also just for being a wonderful friend. I'm excited to see and cheer you on for this next piece. And for you all, coming to the close of today's session, and Kathy, I know I've been back and forth with you. I don't know if do you want to quickly say something? I'll toss it to Kathy for a moment.
Thank you. Thanks. If it's okay, I just, I wanted to say I was in the breakout session with Chris and Pamela from Pullen, and our time got squeezed. So anyway, I'm bringing The Road to Damascus as told by grandmother to Little Red, which is a piece that explores a lot of these issues and conversations by combining Paul's conversion experience with the story of Little Red Riding Hood, and grandmother tells the whole thing. She's an incarcerated woman who has spent 50 years in prison. And yeah, so much more to say, but I'm going to be there before our next IDAT call. I'm going to be there on June 2nd. So Shalise and Kathy also, and Chris and Pamela, I hope I get to meet y'all in
Yeah,
person.
we're looking forward to it.
Yay. Thanks so much. Okay. See y'all.
It's so exciting. I love these when you all are seeing each other in person. It's becoming real. We've got just a couple moments before we close the official part of the session. We will have the breakout rooms open again. As usual, if you all would like to take that time. What we really wanted to kind of leave you with this evening before we open those up is we've now had a chance to visit each of your churches. I've had a wonderful experience with all of you, so impressed with what all of you are doing. And we know a big piece of the conversations in each place was the upcoming June event. And so for tonight, we really wanted to open that space up so that you could continue planning. We know that for some of you, this might be, one of very few times that it might be easy for you to all be in one place. And I wanted to leave you and kind of encourage you with some of the things that we saw and heard on our trips with you about how this is coming along. First of all of you have some really great and amazing ideas about what you're wanting to do. All of them are a little bit different, are a little unique, and are going to take you to some new and interesting directions. And so as you think about fleshing out and continuing at those plans, some of the things we heard are from you that you're doing is how you're going to be able to use this activity to take a next step, to make it an invitation for people to build on what you are starting. Each of you have now really opened this up more officially to the rest of your congregation for those with interest to, share how they want to be a part. And so being able to think about that piece and what that looks like. Some of you have started thinking about plans beyond specifically June, and kind of June being a launching point for a series of different activities, including looking at ways that you can gather input from the congregation. And so we invite you all, if you haven't considered that piece, to look at that as well. June can really be about starting that deeper conversation with the congregation. What does it look like to provide a mechanism for them to think about things and respond to you? Is that some kind of an anonymous form that you can do a link to? Is that a physical, what is it called? The box. I can't think of the name of it.
A
Back in the day.
suggestion? A
Yes,
suggestion box?
thank you. Is it a physical suggestion box where people can put ideas or thoughts that they might not be comfortable sharing or attaching their name to? And does that logistically make sense for some of your church members? Whatever that might be, just think about how you incorporate that. And what it might look like. We want to share that we, of course, are all here in next month's session, June the 3rd. A big part of that is about it being a working planning session where all of us can be here with you and kind of planning through those final details, giving suggestions, and anything that we can do to help you with pulling that off. So that's what the focus will be for next week's meeting. We'll have time after that for you all to then kind of share about the visits and maybe what you've been able to do since, but we really wanted to be able to focus on June since it's right around the corner. And with that, I would ask, we have a volunteer to close us out in prayer before we open the rooms. Lil, love it. Beautiful hand.
Thank you, dear Lord, for all the ways you bless us and provide for us each day. Thank you for new friendships that we made in this group. Thank you for the vision of what can be. And Lord, we pray for your continued protection and blessings on each individual participating and on our home churches. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
We locked into the November date, pretty much so.
Oh, yes, the November dates, 13th through, those are locked in. They're not moving. And so we'll be, this month, we'll actually be getting some more detailed information to you. All right.
Great night, everybody.
Questions for